Okay, well let's get back to work in a way. I just had a lot of small conversations, little short time there. Each one of them was sterling, and I wish we could all sit down and kind of move from table to table and talk about things and talk through things, because all of this stuff, this is nothing that I'm saying is something I've brought to the table or anything new. I mean, it is this stuff that's in us. It is our life, and I think what Merton is so amazingly gifted in, even without him knowing it, was how when he just opened his life, almost everybody in the world could find some kind of connection or hit a responsive chord. That as he was opening up his life, he was opening up life itself. And people could see their life, even though they weren't male, or they weren't monk, or they weren't Catholic, or they weren't born in 1915, or whatever the particulars would be. It was and so we were just talking about him grumbling about some things. He would write, if you read his journals, they're so different than his letters to people, which are so different than his formal essays, and then the books that he wrote just on purpose as a book. A lot of his books are just short essays that he would write and stay on a theme and then move on to something else. In his journals, though, you find him grumbling, complaining about this. The brothers that can't keep a tune in choir, and it drives them crazy and stuff like that. And then he tells a lot of jokes and stories about tricks that people would play on each other. And in his day, they used sign language. You couldn't actually talk in the monastery. They did not take a vow of silence, but it was the silent life. And so, but they created their own sign language of jokes and puns and ridicule and gentle mockery. And he had a lot of fun. An abbot later in the 70s, Timothy Kelly, when he came into Gethsemane, he had read Merton and was inspired by him and wanted to be a Cistercian monk. When he got there, he couldn't find Merton because he didn't know where Merton was. Merton was not known as Thomas Merton. He was known as Father Louis. And so the monks who went to Gethsemane because they read Thomas Merton couldn't find Thomas Merton. And when they went, they thought he was going to be a certain way, like this or something. But this Thomas Merton had a blue jean jacket on, and he was clumsy. He had a devilish grin. He was laughing. He had a deep voice. Listen to his conferences. He was just a real person. And they didn't know that this clown or this goofball or this guy who's kind of blasting down the hall was this incredible saintly intellectual that they had read. So one day Timothy Kelly was speaking to Merton, who was kind of his superior, obviously, and he was explaining himself to Merton, and Merton said, and Kelly said, I've read some books by Thomas Merton, and I've read some by this other guy who was an older monk. And he says, well, what do you think about those book by Merton? I said, well, they're not quite as good as these other books. And Merton didn't let on. So Timothy Kelly later became an abbot, was always fond of that story that Merton, he didn't take himself seriously. So the fact that you came in, you didn't know who he was perfectly fine with that. A psychologist in the 50s, though, told Merton that he had such an ego, he wanted to be the monk in Times Square. This just hit Merton to the core. I mean, it almost cracked him up. He almost had a breakdown. I'll tell you a little bit about that maybe after lunch, but we'll work our way up to that. As somebody who leads a quiet life and then becomes famous, you have to appreciate what this must do to somebody. You're a monk, you're not supposed to talk, and yet you're writing. You're hidden from the world, you're detached. Everybody knows who you are. Everybody was always inviting him to come out and go join a Nicaraguan poet who once was a monk at Gethsemane, Ernesto Cardenal, wanted Merton to come to Nicaragua and join their poetic monastery. Cardenal would later be part of the Sandinistas in the Nicaraguan Revolution. Merton, they wouldn't let Merton go. He thought about it. But we'll get back to Merton's biography in this white page in just a second. Back to Thoughts in Solitude. This is my old copy of it. We don't have, it's in the first book, and it's probably chapter 3, but he says, spiritual life is not mental life. Something about, and this is just a crucial kind of principle for Merton. And he had to learn this. I'll come back to that story. He had to learn that the spiritual life is not the mental life. He grew up very mental. He was an intellectual. And some monks kind of, he rubbed them the wrong way because he was intellectual. He was a poet. He knew language. He spoke in big words. Sometimes maybe talked over them or something. But for Merton, the spiritual life was not mental. It wasn't intellectual in the Western modern kind of sense. And so there's an activity that's proper to us as human beings that he's talking about in this chapter. And he says, our destiny is to live out what we think, because unless we live what we know, we do not even know it. Remember the line there a little earlier, we need to know what we're doing. We need to pay attention. Part of that work is our thoughts. Part of it is dealing with our thoughts. Well, part of centering prayer is realizing these thoughts come and go, and they're kind of fleeting, but we're kind of centering in something that's deeper than the thoughts. But Merton was real, and your thoughts get in the way. So here's a monk who's famous. How does he think about that? How does he think through that? How does he get through his own thinking? How does he pierce and penetrate his own writing so that it doesn't become cliches, which he hated to death? By going a little bit more, actually, if a man is to live, now this is the 50s, still using male pronouns. If man is to live, he must be all alive. Body, soul, mind, heart, spirit. Everything must be elevated and transformed by the action of God in love and faith. If you've read Merton, if you take anything away from this day, please take that Merton was this whole person. And this whole person had wanted to embrace reality, the whole of it. He was not stupid enough to think that he could actually get his arms around the whole thing. If it's the whole, you cannot possess it. You can't commandeer it. You can't get on top of it. You can't be in charge, and you cannot control your own life, because your life is in God and you cannot control God. But you've got to be alive to this. And this is just a thrust of his own life, pushing through his own monastic vocation, and his vocation as a writing. So living for Merton, still in this little chapter early in the Thoughts in Solitude, living is the constant adjustment of thought to life and life to thought in such a way that we are always growing, always experiencing new things in the old and old things in the new. Thus, life is always new. Modern people think that way and think they're on the cutting edge of life by doing the new thing, getting an upgrade to the computer, getting the next size, a larger Pepsi at Wendy's. We're getting the new and improved Tide to wash our clothes. We're familiar. That's Commotion. That's just running around doing the new thing, getting the new car, getting the new wife, a new set of kids. I heard some guy in a bookstore one time talk about his new set of kids. It's like, where do you pick these up? Sears? Is that where you go get a new set of kids, like a set of tires? I was floored by hearing that. But that's how some people live, and that's their sense of new life. For Merton, and we picked this up in this first session, life just keeps blowing. It just keeps blowing. That's what's new. It's perennial. It's persistent. It just goes through everything. And you get a hold of that, but not in the way that you possess it, but in the way you stay close to it. That's being attentive. But we got to go through something. So I'm going to come back to Merton's life. We'll pick up after he gets in the monastery. Let's do that now, and then we'll read this thought about breaking through. So we're on that white sheet. Official page number 8, The Contemplative Journey of Merton, in part 2, Monastic Years, Illumination. His life kind of falls sort of like Dante's Inferno and the Paradiso, and then the Purgatory in the middle. When he wrote his best-selling autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, that was taken from Dante. The 7-story mountain was purgatory, the 7 levels of purgatory, and you've got to go through all these sins. Well, Merton felt like he had all of those sins, and he had to go through all of those sins to get to the top. And in Dante, when you get to the top of Mount Purgatorio, then you look up and you see paradise. And that's when the circle of angels is around in the visual terms of Dante. Well, he has read, because he's an English major, and he's a poet. He's already read Dante. And so that when he becomes a monk and he writes his autobiography, at the command of his abbot, who told him, write your life story. I think people would like to know how you got here. And so he does that. We'll come to that in just a second. 42, let's start there though. He's entered the monastery, December 1941. So 1942, he breaks from his own journal writing, doing his own writing his own poetry. He had a novel he wanted to finish. But he's become a monk, and he abandons writing. He says, I've given up my literary career, my future. I'm not going to write. I'm going to be a monk. I'll do whatever they tell me. This is his head when he goes in. So he's received in the novitiate on the 21st. They give him the name Father Louis. The next year, his brother John Paul is reported missing in action. John Paul went to the university in the States, but then he joined the Royal Air Force of Canada during World War II, and he was shot down over the Atlantic. And Merton wrote a beautiful poem. I did not bring it, but if you read some of his collected poems or some of the other editions, For My Brother is the name of it. And the gist of the poem is, I would gladly give my life for you. You died, I would just as soon take your place and let you live this life as a monk. That was his last relative, his last close relative. It's a moving poem. It's one page, but it's a striking poem. He didn't have that. He was very close to his brother, but they didn't have a whole lot shared because they lived so separately. But he's in the monastery, and then he receives word that his brother, the last one in his family, has now died, and so Merton is really kind of all alone in this strange place in just 1 year. And he's only 28, He takes simple vows, he writes some poems, he takes solemn vows, and these are sort of the order of vows in 3 years' time when you enter a monastery before you become a monk. It can take a little later. 1948 is when he publishes his autobiography. There's a lot that's happened between 42 and 48, so I'm just putting down some basics here. What you should know and appreciate if you don't already is that when you become a monk, you're assigned work tasks. You pray most of the day and you work most of the day. Work, prayer, is the sort of the slogan or the motto of the Cistercians: work, prayer, and study. So they have a library, they have books. So you pray, liturgy of the hours. That's what they mean by going to choir, chanting the Psalms. You study, you read the classic works of spirituality. Then you do work, which is the work of the maintenance of the monastery and whatever the trade is that earns the income to keep the place going. One of Merton's jobs was to plant trees. And they said that he planted thousands of trees and they all died. He planted the wrong kind of trees for the ecology of the region, but he thought they'd be nice trees. Later he really wanted a hermitage. So he's in the monastery and he wants more quiet. Well, Cistercians at that time did not have hermits. That was not in their tradition. It was a communal order. Well, Merton kept pushing and pushing and pushing. Finally, his abbot let him. When the abbot stepped down and retired, he became a hermit. But for the longest time, he fought Merton on this. But one of the pseudo-hermitages that Merton was given was a fire tower. And he was given the job of being the forest fire watcher. And this was in the days when the Park Service would love anybody in any part of the state to keep a watch of fires, especially in the South at the time. We still had a whole lot of forests. So he loved nature, he loved trees, he loved deer, he loved birds, snakes. He's a very nature guy, but he was not mechanical. So that when they gave him jobs that were mechanical, he struggled. He could not drive to save his life. They didn't let him drive after a while, especially after one incident where he rode this Jeep and he was all off the road half the time.